Aufnahme läuft bei mir, Juri, bei dir läuft es auch, hoffe ich.
Yep.
Und dann drücke ich mal auf den Start Recording Knopf. Ja, okay. Mal gucken, ob es was wird. All right, everyone. As I said, the lecture will be in English, except for the introductory lecture. Feel free to ask questions in German if you want. This should not be any barrier for you to ask questions. You can always ask questions in the chat, although I will probably not always pay attention to the chat. But Yuri can tell me or anybody else. And when I'm screen sharing, for example, so I'm gonna disable the public chat when I'm screen sharing. Yeah, for now we can see just the slides, which is okay. And yeah, today's topic is VueJS, an introduction into VueJS, into single-page application frameworks, and yeah, and we will also introduce the next homework exercise. So first of all, the JS stands for JavaScript. It's a JavaScript framework, and it's a so-called single-page app framework, and it's using client-side rendering. And maybe, first of all, do you know what client-side rendering actually means? Yes or no? Do you know what client-side rendering means? That would be interesting to know in advance. All right, I'm going to publish the results. Nothing changes significantly. So a couple, if you know, but there are still plenty who don't know what client-side rendering means. So client-side rendering means that you update. So first of all, a web application is an application which you would use through a browser. And traditionally, the HTML would be rendered on the server that you access with a HTTP request, for example. And client-side rendering means that you change the HTML on your client, that is in your browser, in case of a web application. So, I mean, if we start chronologically, I would say that traditionally you would have for example, a file server where you would just upload your HTML. You go to a website and you get the HTML file. HTML file is being displayed and rendered, displayed in the browser. Then there was web applications like I don't know, Rails, who would get the HTTP request and based on that create the HTML on the fly and send it back to the browser. That has a couple of advantages. For example, you don't have a static HTML file anymore, but the browser can, for example, show different users a different web page. Think of Facebook, for example. Depending on which user is currently logged in, you will see on the same URL a different website, all right? And that is done through a web server and application server, which is like checking who's being logged in and then showing a different site. Does that make sense for now? Can you follow me? Sounds good. And the problem with these web applications was that you always have to wait for an HTTP request to finish before you see something. And that was one of the motivations for doing client-side rendering. In the recent years, let's say the past 10 years or so, more and more users were asking companies or were expecting web applications to behave similar as their desktop applications, or let's say their native applications on their phone. That is, applications must be snappy, must be reactive, must be fast. And so the idea was to render or update the website on the client, which is faster. You can see here a diagram which is supposed to showcase that. So you have a server, and that's the server. And when the browser makes an HTTP request, the server can then handle the HTTP request and send back an HTML file, for example. And then for this period, the browser has to wait. Then there's maybe another click, and the user is navigating to another page. which will trigger another HTTP request, and the server will respond back. In contrast to that, we have client-side rendering, where the browser is making an initial HTTP request to the server, gets a bunch of JavaScript libraries and an initial HTML page, and that from then on is able to update this website on its own. So when you click on something and the website updates, that does not make another request to the server, but the browser can do it on locally, right? Yeah, so does that make sense for now? Okay, that sounds quite good. Maybe a quiz question. I told you that with client-side rendering, the motivation is to have desktop-like behavior, like snappy user interfaces and so on, and navigating through pages is much faster, and you can also update different parts of the website simultaneously. What about the initial page load? What do you think? Which is faster? Is server-side rendering initially faster, or is client-side rendering faster? So I'm going to create a custom poll: server-side rendering, client-side rendering, start custom poll. Which one is faster on the initial page load? So this one here. All right, interesting. People take more time to choose the answer. So I'm going to show the results, and most people said server-side rendering, and that is correct. And the answer is simple, because there is more to download, right? Because the server on client-side rendering needs to give the client the necessary JavaScript frameworks, for example, to update the website. And that's just an additional load, which will make the website slower. And if, for example, you only have like a blank page initially, which will be updated once the browser has all the dependencies at hand to create, for example, the document object model, like the DOM, and there's an initial page which is just blank, then you see this, if you go to, for example, to a website, you see this blank page for like 2 seconds, and then once the HTTP request is finished, you see that the content is showing up. And that is something that you can see if you have a client-side rendered only website. There are ways how to get around this problem, which is like basically doing both. So you combine server-side rendering and client-side rendering, which means on the initial page load, you get some HTML along with the dependencies to update the website locally. So before the website is fully loaded, you already see the HTML, which was handed over by the server. And then once all the dependencies are downloaded, the browser can take over. Okay. So I think I'm gonna go over to the next slide. So that should basically show you what's the basic difference between server-side rendering and client-side rendering, all right? Okay. And most single-page app frameworks, including VueJS, use a so-called virtual DOM. What's a virtual DOM? A virtual DOM is like an abstraction of structured text. So think of the DOM as the abstraction of structured text, and a virtual DOM would be an abstraction of the DOM, right? We have 2 links here, which I'm gonna click on later on. But for now, maybe we can click forward to give you a rough example. So if that's how a website looks like, right? So that's, by the way, the homework example which I implemented. then the resulting HTML is a piece of text, which you can see here, right? And you're seeing how different things correspond to parts of this website. So you see this upvote button here and there, and you have the form element, which is down here, but this is basically just text. Now, the browser is able to create the DOM from this text, which is basically this. It's what you can see if you go to any website and you right-click on Inspect. Then you see this Element tab popping up, and that's basically a parsed representation of HTML, right? That's the DOM, in fact. And you can see again how the different parts correspond with each other. So here's like the news list heading, which you can see here. And then I think I opened for the screenshot this particular piece, and you can see the 3 buttons down here, right? So that's the DOM. And now we have the virtual DOM, which looks like this. So I installed the so-called VueJS DevTools browser plugin. And with this browser plugin, you can see the virtual DOM. A VueJS or the virtual DOM of a VueJS app is composed of so-called components, which are also in a hierarchy. And you can see those components with the browser plugin. And it looks like this. So you have this app component. This app component has one component called news list. Then you have 3 news item components, which you can see here, right? So each of those is one component, and then you have the news form, which is this thing here, right? So that's like the virtual DOM. Does that make sense so far? Can you follow? Nice. And I can see someone is having troubles. If you have any questions, right now I can have a look into the public chat, or you can just unmute your microphone and ask a question right away. If not, maybe I'm going to show my screen and we'll have a quick look on these links. So someone is typing. I don't know if I should go continue or wait for the question. Isn't it inefficient to provide an additional abstraction? That's right. That's a great question. So someone is asking, it's another layer of indirection, right? And that's correct. And some frameworks claim that modern browsers are become efficient on manipulating the actual DOM. One of those frameworks is called Svelte. And okay, you can see the difference. So the Svelte is, for example, claiming that we don't need to have this layer of abstraction on top of that. Browsers are performant enough to handle changes to the DOM, but other single-page frameworks like React.js, VueJS, also Ember.js, and as far as I'm concerned, also Angular, although I'm not so sure, are using this virtual DOM. But that's actually right. That's totally correct. More questions up to this point? Doesn't seem like it, so I'm going to close this view of the public chat and going to share my screen. So you should see my screen now. And let's click on these links for a second. So here I just randomly searched for an explanation of the virtual DOM. And I found I didn't really read through the entire text, I just had a look on the code. But for example, the author of this blog post is claiming that, well, first of all, we have HTML explaining what's the DOM. And then if you would manipulate the DOM at runtime with JavaScript, for example, it would probably look like this, right? So you just take an item from the DOM and you, for example, you search by class name. So that would be, for example, this one here, right? Yes, list item, and then the first one. And then you have this list item, and then you replace the text content with list item 1. We can actually do the same thing if we wanted here on this website. So I'm going to right-click on Inspect, and I just randomly select, or let's say this thing here. What's going on? I don't know why it's not selecting what I want to select. Just try it again. There we go. So you can see this one here corresponds with this paragraph, and I can, for example, I don't know, give it an ID, change me, and then I can go, for example, to the JavaScript console. Oh, interesting. Hope you're having a great day. Good. Nice. Anyways, I can, for example, say element and document get element by ID, change me. There I have it, right? So this is this element, and then I can basically do the same thing. Text content, I don't know, hello course systems development and frameworks. And if I hit enter, then you can see it's being updated, right? So that's how you can update the DOM at runtime. That's what those JavaScript frameworks do all the time. And the motivation of the virtual DOM is that the DOM wasn't made for this, right? And that's also like referring to your question. Isn't it another layer of abstraction? Yes, it's like a discussion whether or not this is the way to go. And so those frameworks who use a virtual DOM basically have an internal structure, which could, for example, look like this, right? So just a JavaScript object. You probably have seen this. JavaScript objects are what dictionaries are in Python or hashes in Ruby. You have a key value pair, and a value can also be another object or a list. And so you can build up a tree-like structure, which could correspond, or which could be an abstraction of the DOM, all right? And these things can easily be changed in JavaScript. So the idea is, okay, let's have this this abstraction somewhere in memory, and then we change it at runtime, and frequent updates. We would take this thing here as an input and create the actual HTML based on that, right? Well, actually, that's the whole idea of the virtual DOM. I hope that somehow makes sense. I'm gonna probably ask you again if you can follow me. I'm gonna stop the sharing and go to the lecture and create a new poll. Can you follow me? Nice. Cool. All right. Next up would be component and composition pattern. Oh yeah, I'm going to publish the results. If you have questions, feel free to just jump in right ahead and either post them in the public chat or just unmute yourself, and I hope I can answer them. Maybe let's try out VueJS for a second, and I'm going to show you this thing here in reality. So close that one again, share my screen. So let's get started with VueJS, I would say. If you go to VueJS, you will end up at the official documentation of VueJS on vuejs.org, and click on Get Started. And it's really straightforward, right? So basically, you can write any, you can have any HTML file, and you just include this library, and there you're good to go. You can also use the minified version, and then the magic happens. So the documentation here is not recommending Vue CLI. I think for educational purposes, if you want to implement your homework later on, you can just use a normal index file like this, index HTML file. So this would be a piece of HTML, and then you have, at some point, you mount your VueJS application, and then you have a JavaScript part, which looks like this, and there you would use VueJS. So this works because you import VueJS here. That's where the library is coming from. And then you have access to this global view object and create a new app. And this would mount the application and somewhere in your DOM. So here you can see this ID app, and this thing here corresponds with this ID. All right, so hashtag always means ID in CSS selectors. So this thing here will render the application here, right? So if you want to follow the tutorial, right, this would go here always, the template part, and this would go in the script part. Okay, it's going on like this, adding more examples, and you're free to do it like that. For convenience, I'm going to use VueCLI because VueCLI is also setting up single file components for me. Let's check out VueCLI. Oh, I had a typo, but it doesn't matter. Google knows. This is a command line tool which helps you to set up a VueJS project really quickly. So if you go to get started, you basically just have to install add VueCLI with your favorite JavaScript package manager, let it be Yarn on NPM. So you probably do something like Yarn global add VueCLI and VueCLI service global, which is also mentioned somewhere here. Installation. Yeah, there you go. So you can either use NPM or you can use Yarn. I'm using Yarn because I prefer Yarn over NPM. And then you would have, once you do that, you have this global Vue command installed. All right, so I'm currently using version 4.5.7. And then you can start creating your first component. Yeah, you can do some instant prototyping. I think here they also ask you to install one package more, which is this VueCLI service global thing. And then you would use the command line tool view and use this subcommand serve, and then whatever file you want to serve. So we have those single file components which have the file extension .vue. This all might be a little bit too much for now, but you will see once I create this file what I'm talking about. So I'm going to create a file called app.vue and create a template, right? And say, hello, dear course. Okay. And this template, I mean, you probably recognize that. This template refers to what the VueJS tutorial is doing here, okay? So this is exactly what we do. We put this into this template thing. And if I have the VueCLI command installed, I can go to this app.vue file and basically just say vue serve app.vue. What now happens is that there's a development server being started which just serves this particular single file component. Those files with the file extension .vue are single file components. Okay. Now I can go to localhost 8080, which I'm going to do. And you can see, hello, dear course. All right. And well, yes. So, and what I wanted to show you is how you can use the Vue DevTools. You can also click on inspect, and I have the Vue DevTools installed. And there's my virtual DOM. How do these Vue DevTools come on my machine? The Vue DevTools is a Chrome browser plugin. So you can just search for Vue DevTools, and you will get on a page where you can install this browser plugin, which I'm advising you to do. It's a nice tool for debugging VueJS. There's a similar browser plugin for Firefox, for example. Once you have installed that, you can go to any VueJS application in development and right-click on something, say inspect, and then you have this tab, VueJS. And here you can see the virtual DOM. And now you understand where my screenshots were coming from. All right. I'm going to pause for a second and create another poll if that was okay from the speed. Okay, fair enough. I didn't introduce too many things at a time. Most people can follow. Great. And there's also one message in the public chat. He has a point. Okay, yes, that's right. Okay, good. Then I'm going to continue.
Ich glaube, da sind noch zwei andere Fragen.
There are two more.
Okay, two more questions. I'm going to have a check. I'm not sharing my screen, which is good, so we can have a look into the public chat. Depending on the size of our project, it can get really messy. Would also recommend single file components and Webpack. Yes, it's up to you, right? So that was an experience from last semester. People were complaining that I wasn't giving the right, like pushing people in the right direction. I can tell that using Vue CLI would probably be much easier to set up than using than doing the same, setting up everything yourself, but it's still possible. And it's sometimes confusing because the syntax on the VueJS tutorial is different than a single file component. So the syntax on VueJS tutorial is like assuming you don't use Vue CLI. That's the problem here. But it's up to you. Choose whatever is best for you. You can also do both. Why not? Isn't it better to add the script tag that imports VueJS inside the body? Otherwise, if the HTTP link that fetches the library cannot do so, I don't really understand the question. I mean, if it wouldn't make this global VueJS object available, then you would get a runtime error, right? So you import the library, and then you have another script in which you create the VueJS application and then mount the VueJS somewhere in your DOM. And the fact that you can say new Vue application and create this global Vue object would fail if you, at the time the JavaScript library wouldn't be available. Yeah, I'm talking about the template. You can put it above the script that initialized Vue, so there won't be any runtime. Yeah, that's exactly the case. I think that was the case in the index HTML. Let me see. I'm going to share my screen again. So you have this is where the library is coming from. This is the script tag, and it's below the template that's being controlled by VueJS, right? So there's one script tag. There's another one of that.
Yeah. So basically, you have to put it in the body tags for it to work, because if you put it in the head tags, it will get compiled before the DOM is created, and you cannot mount then the virtual DOM.
There you go. Thank you very much. Yes, that's correct. Okay. More questions. Feel free also just to unmute yourself and ask it right away. Also in German. I don't want you to feel afraid of asking questions in English. It's no problem. Otherwise, I'm going to continue on. So we have this thing here, which is the file called app.vue, which currently just consists of heading. And this is called a single file component because you can put the template, the HTML, the JavaScript, and CSS into one location, which I think is a nice idea. All right, a single file component has these three parts, which are optional, I think, except for the template. And this is where your JavaScript goes. If I could type correctly, script. And this is where your CSS goes. CSS goes here. All right. And yeah, to show it to you, we can, for example, say, I don't know, heading level 1 should be maybe blue. And then you have a blue heading, right? And this is where JavaScript goes into. We will come to that later. But you can see what's the main advantage here of putting everything in one file, because everything that relates with this component, like its styling, its behavior, which you would put into this part, as well as the markup is going in like one location, which is, yeah, I think it's a great idea from the developer's perspective.
There's another question whether we can reference outside files from CSS, from the CSS part.
Yes, that's also possible. You can reference like global CSS, right? So CSS that's affecting all components, and you should do that. In fact, if you can do this in single file components, which will lead to a CSS applicable, like the CSS will be scoped only on this component. So I think we can see it here. No. I'm currently a little bit lost. I was expecting to see, or maybe I didn't write it, didn't save it. I was expecting to see scoped CSS. I didn't try it out when I was preparing the lecture, so maybe this just doesn't work like I'm used to. But normally, then you would get. I think I'm used to using Nuxt, and it's all set up there. And then you would scope this CSS rule to this component only. But you can likewise import global CSS. And in fact, if you have a CSS rule put here, this by default affects also other components within the same application. So you would have to add more specificity to the CSS rules or things like that. But yes, global CSS is, of course, possible.
A new question is whether a component is equivalent with one file.
Well, if you use single file components, then you have for every component, you have one file. One component doesn't usually consist of more than one file. Does that answer the question?
But of course, one component can include more components.
That's correct. That's correct. But we'll come to that later.
Yeah, and then it would be more files, but yeah, it's like a tree then.
Exactly. We'll come to that later.
And the component is defined as a file that has one template is another question?
Yeah, I think if you don't have a template, then you will get an error.
So the template is basically the root of the component?
I think the only thing that's not optional is one template tag. So now I think I'm expecting an error.
And so that means that two templates are not possible, two template in one file.
Yeah, I think you will get unintended side effects. I think if you do that, then the last template tag will win. Second template tag. I don't know if it leads to an error. Yeah, so it doesn't lead to an error, but the second one wins. You would normally never do that, all right? So you always have, usually you always have these three things here. These two are optional, and this one is required. Okay, so it makes sense.
I think so. I didn't ask another question, but another question is whether there are only data-only components. Whether there are no data-only components.
What is a data-only component?
I guess a component that only contains data.
Maybe a renderless component, something like that. So there's a concept called renderless component, which is...
Yeah, that's what he means.
Yeah, okay. So a renderless component is a component that gives as much control over the template to the developer. So the idea is of having a component that's only, which has the responsibility of only doing logic things, doing basically behavioral things, and how the component is being styled and what kind of markup it has is up to the developer who's using that component in the actual application. So renderless components are great for implementing for implementing a framework, I would say. If you use a component library which comes with existing components, you often have the problem of fighting sometimes against the framework because it's not as easy to customize. And the concept or the idea of renderless components is basically to have components that only do the behavior and give control about the other things back to the developer. Does that answer the question?
Well, basically that means that, I mean, you can still have a template, just leave it empty and use it to contain data or logic. But I don't know whether this is really common in Vue.
It is. There's a technique for that. And let's go back to the lecture, and we'll come to that later. You can use slots for doing renderless components. A slot is where the developer who's using the component can put in additional markup, right? So this is how a component will look like with a slot. And then you can use the component somewhere else. And the developer who's using the component somewhere else can then say, okay, I want to add this particular piece of markup to the header, right? And I want to put this particular markup into the main slot. And then one piece of markup, one part of the template will show up here, and the other one will go here. And slots and name slots are perfect to create so-called renderless components in VueJS. Yeah, but that's advanced. Let's start from the beginning, okay? All right, I'm going to share my screen again. I hope this answers the question. If more, then feel free to ask. Let's go to the VueJS tutorial and just try to follow it for the moment. All right, as I said, when you use Vue CLI and use single file components, you have a little to translate this code a little bit into your single file components. Okay, so this thing here, for example, this is just the HTML ID where the VueJS is supposed to be rendered. So you can basically forget about that, because in single file components, this is controlled by the transpiler, and you don't have an existing website, for example, where you put the VueJS app somewhere in mounted in a particular location. It's all controlled, and you don't have to worry about that anymore. But you have to worry about this thing here, right? So if I want to basically do the very same thing, I would, for example, copy this code here and put it, let's say, here. Okay, so curly braces means interpret this part as JavaScript and then render the return value of that as a string in the template. And I'm going to copy this piece here. The data hook is the internal state of the component. Let's maybe have a look on the browser first. So you can see there's this app component which has no reactive state. And if I add this data thing, this data hook, to the component, then I do have reactive state. And the way how you write it is you use ECMAScript exports, which look like this. So you say export default, and then an object. So objects in JavaScript are written in curly braces. And you copy that. Interestingly, this will lead to a runtime error because it's expecting the data key in this dictionary to have a function as a value. So this here is having an object as a value. And to make it a function, we just say something like return. Okay, now I have a function which is returning an object. Hello Vue. Okay. So I can see with my Vue Dev tools, I can see the data message, hello Vue. Oh, nice. I can even change that. I didn't know. Oh, that's not a JavaScript string, hello SDF. Even updating it immediately. Nice. That's cool. Okay, so this is the data hook will always initiate the reactive state of the component, right? So this is the key message, and I can then reference message within the template. And it will then put this string over there and render the string in the template, and I can change message at runtime. Okay, and that's the nice part about VueJS. I don't have to worry about re-rendering this template anymore, because that's what VueJS is doing for me automatically. That's why I'm using VueJS at all. Like, I don't want to update the DOM myself. If you think of jQuery, for example, with jQuery, you would be responsible for keeping the DOM up to date. And that would usually lead to a lot of spaghetti code. And here I have one framework which is doing the job for me, and I just don't have to worry about changing the internal state of components. That's my job. And then the actual re-rendering is done automatically for me. I don't have to worry about anything anymore, which is nice. So we go forward through the tutorial. Then, for example, they change the date and they add new date to it. Okay, why not? Maybe this is not very interesting, but every time I reload the page, there's another date being added there. But I can also change things at runtime, where, for example, with a button. Like this. I think I like this one here. So you can see there's a button. And it's calling a method called reverse message, which refers to this thing here. So alongside with data, I can add methods to the component and give these methods a name. And these will always have a function as a value. All right. So let's do that. So next to this, always don't forget to add the comma here. So I have these methods, and this reverse message corresponds with this thing here in the template. And this is a so-called event. So we have this v-on, which signals, okay, this will register an event. In this case, the click event on the button. So when the button is clicked, something should happen. And what should happen? The reverse message should happen. Right? And reverse message is referencing this message here. And it's doing so by saying this dot message. So this dot message refers to the internal state of the component. And then I can change this message. This message should be this message split. So we are splitting the different words and separated by, oh no, it's just splitting it by empty string. So that would just make it an array of characters, reverse it, and then rejoins it. So let's change the message maybe again to hello SDF. All right. And then I will run it to this particular error. The template root requires exactly one element. That's a peculiarity of those single page app frameworks. Each component must have one root element. Okay, now I have two. I have the heading and a button. And this is easily fixed by just wrapping it in for example, in a div element. That's it. There we go. Okay, now I have like a heading and this button reverse message, and now I reverse the message. And I can follow that here. This is the state. Click on that and it updates it. And you can see that it never had to worry about updating the actual DOM. right? This is done by the framework for me, which is the nice part. All right. All good up to this point. Any questions?
There is a question. I just read it out loud. Are you only referencing to the name of the method in the button event? How can you pass an arguments then?
Yes, that's a great question. So you can actually pass arguments. I think it just works like, I think the click event is already passing arguments. I don't have to do anything anymore. Let's see. Args, and let's console log that. So the click event is already emitting, like it's emitting this click event and passing over arguments. In this case, the mouse event, where I can, I don't know what else do, like expect things.
Where exactly you click the button, for instance.
Yeah. Right. So this component, in this case, the button, which is emitting the event, can emit arguments. What's also possible is that I think the syntax is just that. You can make this a function call, and then and you give it your own arguments. So this is like JavaScript. This is just a pointer to the function, which means I give, like, it's like a callback. I give this click event the callback reverse message, which is just the function. Or I can make a function call when this should happen, which is not the same thing. I don't even know if that actually works. Let's see. Yeah, it works. So this is like from the semantics, it's a little bit different.
You can also show the event in the Vue DevTools if you like. There you can see the parameters and everything.
I have a question.
Or actually, no, you can. I don't see this particular event right now. Oh, I think I have to click on record, and no. I didn't try that out.
Is it an actual event though, if you're just calling it inside and not emitting anything?
I
think it's only an event if
I
you...
think you have to emit it specifically, right?
Some events. Yeah, maybe it's just, I mean, the click event is also an event, but maybe it's only checking my events. Yeah, there we go. Okay, we come to that later. So this is how you can debug your events that you yourself are emitting. But I'm a little bit disappointed that you cannot log all events also from components like button, for example. Anyways, so this is how you can emit and debug events. More questions?
Yes, actually, right now there are two more questions. One was a little bit answered. No, not really. So the one question is regarding the template and the div you introduced. Does the div bracket structure the two elements, h1 and button, into one component?
Does that structure the two elements into one component? Well, it's still a one component from the very beginning.
I think the wording here you have to be careful, because in VueJS you call it one component if you export it and have one in what we're just doing just now, one view file. So it's still everything is in one component, but maybe he means what you see in the DOM.
So the div is in the DOM. So every component is responsible for rendering one part of the virtual DOM. And if you say my root element is a div, then this root element will also be added to the actual DOM, right? I mean, I can make the button my root element, and then the div will vanish, and only the button will remain. Okay, now you just have the button. And then this is the root element. Think of the DOM, and you mount a component at a particular location, just like if you mount a USB drive in your file system, for example. Does that make sense? Is that a good metaphor? I don't know. I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, I hope so as well. Let's go to the next question first. This is regarding your JavaScript code. Is there any reason why you used basically the old way of arrow function and then the function call afterwards?
Yeah,
because they are
so
basically
arrow
the same, right?
functions are, no. Arrow functions are slightly different. Wrong. I have to put it here. This use of this is different with arrow functions. I don't know if that works now, or if I get a runtime error. No. So that's yet another topic. Arrow functions and function keyword JavaScript difference. So this has another meaning in JavaScript if you use an arrow function or the normal function. Yeah, this, for example. And I never can really get my head around this fully, but it has a different meaning. But it might be that this still works, like I'm able to access this dot message here, even with an arrow function, because VueJS is doing some magic in the background. So I was expecting a runtime error, which is not happening. And what I actually do most of the time, I'm using this syntax here. So like that. I'm also I'm sometimes a little bit confused by the different ways of syntax, but there is a difference between the arrow function like this and function keyword. Because if you access this, I think this in a function will reference the caller of the function. Whereas this in an arrow function refers to the thing being called. I would suggest that you have a look or search that on the internet, and because I wasn't really, if I'm gonna explain functional programming with JavaScript, we can come back to that, and I can promise you to really go into detail here. But yeah, there is a difference. Although I don't know if that makes any difference in this particular use case. I don't think so. So when I read VueJS components, I used this particular syntax. And if you ask me what this is equivalent to, if this is an arrow function or not, I couldn't even tell you the right answer. Does it help at least?
Yeah, I think this answers the question. I think he also remembers that it was like that, and he's assuming that it just probably just reassigns this to the function reference before invoking the function.
Yeah, I would have to go into detail to really give you a proper answer. What's going behind the scenes if I use arrow functions or normal functions in a VueJS component. But nicely, this works in any case.
Okay. I think that's it for now on. There's still a few people typing, but I think you can continue for now.
Nice. Yeah, if you can also just unmute yourself and
yes, always feel free. Happy to read those out, but if you talk to them yourself, it's probably easier for you as well.
All right. So well, I hope you get the idea of why such a framework is useful and why it's improving your code. And oh yeah, in the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned that it's like it has client-side rendering has certain drawbacks. And I mentioned seeing this blank page if you, for example, don't have JavaScript enabled. So let's say if you disable JavaScript and you go to the same web page, what you actually see is this, right? You see a piece of HTML, and you see this here with the app, and then some JavaScript. And the browser, in this case, my Chromium browser, is capable of using JavaScript and rendering the remaining elements on the DOM. But this is really bad for clients who cannot do JavaScript for one reason or another. For example, there might be clients who cannot do JavaScript. Think of search engine crawlers. I think Google is able to do JavaScript rendering nowadays, but you cannot just assume that a bot which is crawling your website and is doing like building up a search index is able to see the actual content on your web page. So it's really bad sometimes if you just do that for search engine optimization. Another thing, of course, is people who just disable the JavaScript, then they don't see anything. Okay, they basically just see that and that's it. So consider that if you write a single page app, there are arguments in favor of doing that. And there are also good arguments for not doing it and just stick to server-side rendering. All right. Yeah. And if you want to see how not the on-run build, view build, what do I actually have as an option? You can also export what you just saw. If I say app.view, and I don't know what happens actually, but I'm expecting that this is going to transpile the JavaScript and the single file component into the remaining index HTML file, which more or less looks like that.
Yes, I want to once more say that what he's currently doing is prototyping. So he's just living from one view file. Usually, of course, you need the index HTML and everything around that, and you can also generate that with Vue CLI.
Yeah,
this is what you probably have to do for the homework.
Yeah, just to give you like an orientation. So if you run Vue build, then you get this dist folder and you have your index HTML, and you could probably put that anywhere you want. You could upload that to your favorite file server, and then you can go to your website and see this, right? And see this application which would load this JavaScript and then render the application at this, mount the application right here. Okay. So this is what you get. There's your JavaScript, you transpile JavaScript. There's some CSS, which has this CSS rule for H1. All right. And yeah, that's how it works behind the scene. And you can, for prototyping, you can just say vserve, which is doing the same thing, but in like in memory. Oh, come on. All right. Nice. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and go back to the lecture if I can find it somewhere here.
Maybe one more question.
Yeah.
As you just have the screen with the components and React, Ember, VueJS. So one question was what kind of learning curve you have in VueJS compared to React and Angular, maybe other frameworks.
Yeah, that's actually a selling point. So I cannot really tell because I'm experienced in Ember.js and started VueJS from there. And most people are familiar with React.js, and a selling point, but I cannot tell it from my own experience because I'm not so used to React.js, is that Vue.js is more beginner friendly than React.js is. React.js feels more imperative to most people, whereas Vue.js feels more declarative to most people, especially if you come from like a plain HTML, CSS background. Apparently, that's what people say, Vue.js is easier. All right, since I'm not screen sharing anymore, I can have a look into the public chat myself. Oh, wow, 25 messages. Yeah, and there's already Elias explaining the difference of the different ways of declaring a function in JavaScript. All right, I'm going to continue on with the slides for now. Now you see how to implement a single component, but one of the major advantages of this component pattern is that you can compose components in a structured way. You can have a hierarchy of components. You can have one main component which is including other components and controlling how they get rendered, right? And that's I would call it a component pattern. It's like a universal software pattern which is being used in many single-page app frameworks out there, including React, including Ember, as well as VueJS. In React and Ember, this pattern is called data down, actions up. We'll come to the meaning of that later. And here in VueJS, it's called data down and events up. Okay, what does that mean? Think of your application. Think of that here as the virtual DOM. If that's your homework exercise, where you're supposed to create like a news app similar to Hacker News, then you have a list of news items. I just called it items. You can just call it news, however you want, which have a vote. So you can upvote and downvote news. Each news can, for example, link to an external website. I don't know. And each news has, for example, a title, and you can create more items and add them to the list. And if that's your application, then this could, for example, be your virtual DOM. So you have a component which is news list, and you have a component news item, and you have a component news form, and they have clean responsibilities. So the news item is just responsible for displaying one piece of news. And it's displaying, for example, how the votes should be displayed. In this case, it's just a number in the title. It has these 3 buttons, and which is responsible to, for example, to update this counter here. This is the responsibility of this component. Whereas the news list component is responsible for rendering the list and keeping them ordered. So if you want to always ensure that the order of those items is, for example, the news list component is ordering them in descending order, that is, the item with the most votes is at the top, then this would be the responsibility of this component. All right. And this component also renders a news item component for every item it has. Okay. Then at the last, you have this news form component, which is responsible for creating a new item, right? So it's displaying a form which has a submit button and an input, which you can see here. And when I submit this form, this component is responsible of creating a new data news item. And then the components respectively tell the news list, the parent component, hey, I have a news item, please add it to the list. And then the news list component will add this component to the list and create a new news item component. Whereas the news item component could, for example, say, hey, I have been removed. Please remove me from the list. And then the news list removes the item from the list and also updates the DOM. Does that make sense so far? Oh yeah, creating a poll, start a poll. Does that make sense? Okay, looks good. And so I'm going to continue. And this pattern, data down and actions up, refers to the control flow. So data down means that you have like some global data. For example, the array of news items. Every news item consists, for example, of a title and an integer, which is storing the counts. So you have an array, a JavaScript array of objects. Each object has a title and the votes. And that would be what the news list has as internal state. Do you remember? You saw this data hook in a component. That's where you set up the internal state. In our last component, we just had one string. This news list component could, for example, have an array. And then you would iterate through this array and then render news item components for each item. And then pass every item to the news item component, and that's its responsibility to do something with it. All right, so you have like clean responsibilities between those components. And data down means that in turn, each component can then pass on this data that it got from the parent component down to the next component. Think of as if you would pour water. That's how I imagine it always. Like as if I'm pouring down data, and it's like flowing through this tree, this virtual DOM tree. Like you put all the data on the top, and then it's going down. It's like rinsing the data to each component, and every time there's less data being passed on to the next component, right? And for example, in this case, you would have the news item, which has a new ID, for example. If the news list is responsible for creating new IDs, then this news item already has a new ID, but it has no title and no votes. And then this news form component could create some form data with a blank string for the title and with an initial 0 counter for the votes, and then give that title, which is such a blank string, give that to the input component, which is just that here, all right? Just this text input field. Right? So this is like the data down part in this component, in this software pattern, data down, actions up. Does that make sense? I'm going to have a look into the public chat because there's something new. We will work with Vue 2. So VueJS 3 was released, I think 1 month ago, and they still recommend to stick to VueJS 2. But if you're brave, feel free to go directly to VueJS 3. Maybe some of the documentation will not be updated, and then you will run into errors, which I cannot anticipate, but that's then up to you. Yeah.
But I did it with VueJS 3, and that worked fine for me so far. So
yeah.
I think that should also be okay. And I think even, Robert, I think I compiled your project also. So I think this is also possible that you can compile Vue 2 with Vue 3.
Mm-hmm. From what I saw on the announcement, the API will not break off VueJS 2. So VueJS 3 is adding the composition API, which wasn't present in VueJS 2, but everything which was present in VueJS 2 will also work in VueJS 3. Yeah, all right. So
there's another comment which you can maybe read yourself.
Oh yeah, so oh yeah, of course. I mean, this maybe you can. The question is, or the remark is that it doesn't help you at this very moment without having a look at the homework. That's why we record the lecture, so you can also watch it later on when you do the homework, right? So we're going to work on the homework in the seminars, and yeah, and you can do the homework. You have 2 weeks in total to do the homework, and you have a lot of time to rewatch the lecture. And we will also upload the slides as PDF. I think the slides from the introductory lecture are already uploaded. So I think we uploaded both the video on PeerTube and YouTube, plus the slides as a PDF. No, they are not. Is that true? Let's check on Moodle. I didn't upload the slides. What?
She just found them.
Ah, okay, great.
So it's okay.
Yes. I mean, maybe
big shock.
Yeah, maybe I'm a little bit. I'm getting old. I'm happy that you found them. Great. Let's go to the next topic, maybe. So that's like the actions up part. The idea is that if data is flowing down the virtual DOM, then events are going up the DOM tree. Okay, so what is an event? An event could be some kind of user interaction, for example. So a button, for example, knows when the button is being clicked. An input field, for example, knows when the user is entering a character. And the form element, for example, knows when it's being submitted. These are all so-called events, right? Events is using the term events. In other frameworks, you have the term actions. And they are going up the DOM tree, right? So a button just knows, okay, I was clicked. And since the news item has, this component has 3 items with different meanings, like there's one button with a label upvote, there's one button with a label downvote. So when this news item receives the event from this button, for example, it knows, okay, this was the button with a label upvote. I have to add +1 to the votes, right? So this is like, this component has the, let's say, the knowledge about what these buttons are supposed to do, where these buttons only say, okay, I was clicked, and so give that information to the parent component. This parent component can decide, okay, I'm going to do that. For example, add 1 to the counter, and then can also emit another event. So once it updated its internal state, which is this data item, it can give the whole data item with the updated counter to the parent component, because maybe the parent component needs to reorder this list. I mean, if you upvote things, then one item might be like change its position in the ordering. So this component can then check, hey, is the order still correct? And if not, then reorders the entire list and re-renders the DOM, right? So this is also done automatically. And this is a nice example of clean responsibilities, right? This button only knows, okay, I was clicked. This is then responsible for updating the counter and emitting the updated item, and this is reordering that, for example. Can the teams enter the Big Blue Button rooms anytime? Yes, I created Big Blue Button rooms for every team and added every team member as a moderator. And the moderator can start and end the Big Blue Button meetings during the seminar. And I'm asking you to click on end this meeting when you're done, because when we go to the seminar, you and I, we can then see if the meeting room is currently active, and then go to the next group, for example. So when you're done, please click end the meeting.
Yes, also somebody asked you to leave a few minutes in the end for questions.
Of course.
And also another question is how we coordinate the homework in the groups, whether everybody is doing component or pair programming. Maybe you can say something regarding that.
Well, this is more or less up to you. I mean, I want you to organize yourself. And for example, you can use this Fachschaftsrat Discord as a real-time chat. You can, of course, also use the Moodle messages. I think you can see which group you're in. You can see other group members and send them a message. I hope you coordinated yourself already to find the groups in the first place. And I'm not telling you how to coordinate that. For the seminars, you and I will be available to join in your pair programming. And then that's where I would ask you to use the Big Blue Button rooms. So you open the Big Blue Button room meeting and you start it, and then just wait for one of us to join your room and to help you out and answer your questions. I hope that helps. But yes, we progressed quite a lot into the lecture. It's already 3:15. And I would really like to show you how this composition pattern works out in VueJS. Okay, I'm going to share my screen once again. So let's go back to this.
Maybe you can show the shortcuts. I think you got a slide for the shortcuts. Because there are some questions regarding what does add mean? Is there a shortcut for vmodel?
There's a shorthand. So the shorthand for v-on is add. So you see that? I can replace that with add, right? It means the same thing. And a data binding, we don't have data binding right now here, but I'm going to quickly add a new component and pass some data to this component. I'm going to call this component subcomponent, right? And if I want to render, I'm right now in the app component. If I want to render this subcomponent here, I have to register it first. And I register this component by saying import subcomponent from and a file path. So since app component is right here, I can reference the file which is right next to it. So I'm going to say the same folder subcomponent.vue. I can double check by using my editor to jump into this file, which is currently empty. And now I can see that this is the file path is correct. So now I'm importing the subcomponent. In order to render it up here, I have to add it, or I have to register it as a subcomponent. And I do that by adding components like this to the parent component and importing it here. Oh, so subcomponent seems correct. Now I registered this, and I now can render the subcomponent right there. Okay, just below the button. I'm gonna get runtime error because there's no template tag in this subcomponent. Failed to mount component, template or render function not defined. I know, because it's empty. But once I go into the component and say template, hello from subcomponent, you see that. All right, no runtime errors anymore. So this is part of the app component. This is the subcomponent, and I can see that if I go to the VueJS developer tools, and I can also use this thing here and click on that, and it's jumping right there, right? So I have this app component. The app component contains, in a way, the subcomponent. It's part of it, all right? Currently, no reactive state because it's just a piece of template which is being rendered. And I can render as many subcomponents as I want. So I can just copy that and, for example, create 3 subcomponents. And now I have 3 subcomponents. All right? This is how you render subcomponents in your parent component. Now I told you about data down, actions up, and the way how you do that is by so-called data bindings, which is very, very important. The syntax is vbind : the shorthand is just : okay? So vbind or just : is same. And then I must give it a name of the property, some property, and then, similar to this event, reference something which is available in the parent component. Let's give it the message. Why not? So message here refers to this message, my internal state. And I pass this message under the name some property to subcomponent. Think of as if the right side is, let's say, going into the left. Yeah, that's how I imagine it in my brain. And you can see that here. If I refresh the page, you can see that one of them has some property as an attribute, where the other don't. And if I want to reference now some property in subcomponent, do something with it, I need to register my property, some property, in the script tag. So I'm creating this, and I'm exporting a JavaScript object again. And I'm saying props, and this is where I register properties. And here I have to give it the same name as I used it in this parent component. So here I gave message under the name some property to subcomponent. So here I have to register the property some property. All right, and I can also define, if I want to, I can define what data type it is and if it's required or not. I would say true. Now I will get an error for these 2 components which don't have a property. Missing required prop some property. You can see that here. So let's add that real quick. Doing the same thing here. So now I'm giving data from the parent component, from the parent component down to the subcomponent. Not doing anything, of course, but it's there. Subcomponent now has this property, some property. All right.
Eine Frage an,
Yes.
one question. If you hit the reverse button now, it should reverse the string. Is the property also updating?
Yes. If the property of a component gets updated by the parent component, this component will re-render. That's a great question. So you can see that here. This is some property of subcomponent. And you can also see that message is also referenced in the app component, and it all updates, right? And I can show it to you even better by putting or by referencing some property now here. Hello from curly brace, some property. Oh, come on. And then you have it there, right? So this is how you can do the data down in, like, if you have a hierarchy of components. So what's about emitting events?
We should slowly get into the question round, as
Oh
there
yeah,
are
it's already half past. Okay, maybe we'll then I'm not gonna show you how to do the events and go into the question round. That's okay. And I'm gonna introduce you to events in the next lecture or in the homework sessions. So question round, I'm gonna check.
So there are already, maybe you can just share look at the shared notes. I try to sum them up there a little bit.
What are the naming conventions of component names, attributes, elements, and templates? So as far as I'm concerned, there are different naming. I think VueJS has a naming convention. VueJS naming convention. So I think they use hyphens, also called kebab case, for attributes. VueJS style guide. So there's a website. Naming, SAT, attribute. Aha, nice. Okay, so I'm just going to share that into the public chat. Here you go. This is what I just searched on Google. You can actually put that right under the question. So there seems to be naming conventions by VueJS. Let's put that into the shared notes. Is there a fixed project structure? No, there isn't. So there are frameworks like Nuxt.js, which we will later on learn, which has a fixed directory layout. But VueJS is giving you a lot of freedom. And you just have to make sure that the components, like the import statements, are pointing to the correct location. Will you upload the code to the homework repository afterwards? Which code do you mean? You mean my code? I'm obviously not uploading that before the deadline, because then you can just
what you just showed, what you're just currently working on.
No, I think it's so few code or so little code that you can easily write it yourself, I would say. If you follow, I mean, I've just followed the tutorial. I've followed the getting started tutorial on VueJS, and maybe I am doing some errors. I will, for example, double check the question which I couldn't answer regarding functions and all of that. I think if you just follow the tutorial, it should be easy to reproduce. Does this JS runtime always comes with a browser? Well, a browser has a JavaScript runtime usually. Most modern browsers do. And there's a runtime for the server. So you can run JavaScript outside the server, which is called Node.js. If so, how the devs agree of a JS version? Well, you cannot agree on the JavaScript version which is running in the browser of your target audience, because you don't have any control about the device which your customer is using, or for example about the desktop version of the browser. So you must target all browsers, and VueJS is transpiling the JavaScript into a compatible version, which is targeting a number of modern browsers up to a certain point, of course. And you always have to worry about if you add one particular feature which is not available in this version of that particular browser. Usually with Firefox, Chrome, you're good to go. If you use Internet Explorer, you're screwed. I hope that answers the question. And if
maybe I can also say something regarding that. So basically, JavaScript is the most important aspect or component of what is called ECMA script. And ECMA script is actually there are different ECMA script versions, and once in a while there comes a new version. And even one ECMAScript version can be implemented partly by some browsers, and so this is actually a problem. So what you are usually doing to be compatible with all different kinds of ECMA is that you, like Robert said, you use some kind of transpiler to translate the features you're using from the latest version to translate them to the older version, so older browsers can still understand what you're typing. So this is how you work around that.
Yes, it's so the short answer is it's a mess, but it's not JavaScript to blame for it, because it is because of this unique feature that JavaScript has that is running on multiple devices, and you have no control about the device it's eventually running on, because it's in the control of your customer. And so you have this problem that you need to target many different versions. The browsers are slowly catching up with new specifications of JavaScript, but you cannot assume, or you cannot rely on the fact that you have a modern browser running on your customer's device. So you need to target also older versions or other browsers. And then,
so it's basically every year or something they update EMCA, but that doesn't mean that you always have to catch up regarding that because of the transpilers. But maybe we can move on with the questions. Another one is how we work together, basically. If we are doing pair programming, how are we evaluating their grades and stuff like that? Because are group notes group notes allowed?
Group grading, yes.
Grading, thank you.
I mean, it's not a group grading because you get a final grade individually, because the grade is consisting of several things. It's the homework, which is where you are being graded as a group. But there's also lightning talk and your individual grade in the final exam. And all these three together will accumulate and then produce your final grade, which is individual to you. Does that answer the question? Is there another question maybe which I can answer in the meantime? And you can also unmute yourself if you want. Feel free.
Wie wird das gleich in den Gruppenarbeiten laufen? Wir gehen in unsere Big Blue Button Meetings rein und ihr guckt einfach zwischendurch immer mal rein, ob alles okay ist, oder?
So ist es gedacht. Also, ihr sollt euch zu Gruppen zusammenfinden und ihr solltet natürlich eure Gruppenmitglieder kennen und mit denen kommunizieren können. Und dann macht ihr diesen Big Blue Button Meetingraum auf und dann fangt ihr an zu Pair-Programmen. Ihr habt ja Moderatorenrechte, das heißt, ihr könnt den Screen teilen und zusammen an der Hausaufgabe arbeiten. Das könnt ihr natürlich auch außerhalb der Seminare machen, das müsst ihr nicht machen. Aber der Vorteil, wenn ihr es in der Seminarezeit macht, ist, dass Juri und meine Wenigkeit verfügbar sind. Und wir gehen also wenn man es sich so vorstellen würde, im Klassenraum, wo wir auch von Tisch zu Tisch gehen würden, versuchen wir das ähnlich zu machen und gehen sozusagen von Big Blue Button Meeting Raum zu Big Blue Button Meeting Raum. Das ist der Grund, warum ich diese Big Blue Button Meeting Räume erstellt habe. Und das ist auch der Grund, warum die erste Hausaufgabe war, findet euch in Teams zusammen, damit eben genau das jetzt besser klappt. Wir machen also nicht mehr diese Breakout Rooms, sondern ihr sollt sozusagen möglichst selbstständig auch jederzeit, auch außerhalb der Seminarzeiten zusammenfinden können. Ihr könnt auch bei anderen Gruppen reinschauen. Ja? Nur die Moderatoren der Gruppe können diesen Raum anmachen. Genau, und das Ziel ist halt, durch Pair Programming das Wissen möglichst in den Gruppen gut zu verteilen.
Können wir euch auch irgendwie erreichen, falls wir konkrete Fragen haben? Also
ja.
Seid ihr verfügbar?
Ja, genau. Also ihr könnt natürlich immer ins Moodle Forum schreiben. Das Moodle Forum hat den Nachteil, dass ich glaube, es gibt so eine Dreiviertelstunde, bis irgendwie die E-Mail versendet wird. Das heißt, um jetzt in Echtzeit uns zu erreichen, wäre das natürlich sinnvoll, irgendeine Art von Echtzeit-Chat zu haben. Und da hat der Fachschaftsrat schon etwas bereitgestellt. Da gibt es zum Beispiel den Fachschaftsrat Discord-Chat. Also ich werde auf jeden Fall im Discord-Chat auch immer mal reinschauen. Ist wie gesagt noch nichts los. Ich habe diesen Raum Pair Programming anlegen, also darum gebeten, dass er angelegt wird, und ein Admin hat das gemacht. Ich bin, glaube ich, bis jetzt der Einzige, der da eine Nachricht reingeschrieben hat. Da könnt ihr also reingehen und auch mich erreichen. Ja, Ansonsten gehen wir halt einfach durch die Räume durch und versuchen euch zu helfen, so gut es geht. Und wenn das nicht klappt, ne, wenn es zum Beispiel jetzt nicht klappt mit Discord, weil, weiß ich nicht, Moodle hat auch einen Chat, wir können auch das als Echtzeit-Kommunikationsform verwenden.
Der ist halt, glaube ich, der löscht sich, glaube ich, nachdem man das Fenster geschlossen hat und so, ne? Also der hat schon so einige Nachteile, dieser Chat. Und ich glaube, ich weiß auch nicht, ob man da so gut Fotos durchschicken kann und so. Also deswegen, es gibt keine so richtig gute Lösung von der Uni selbst, außer dem Discord.
Genau, es wäre toll, wenn es vielleicht sowas von der Uni geben würde, was ihr auch gerne nutzt. Ja, also es hat ja nicht so viel Sinn, eine Chat-Plattform zu benutzen, die Studenten dann nicht nutzen. Ja, sonst passiert da nicht viel. Und deswegen finde ich das ganz nett, dass der Fachschaftsrat sich darum gekümmert hat, weil ich natürlich darauf hoffe, dass halt eben da auch sonst unterwegs seid oder dass irgendeiner Chat-Messenger ist, den viele Studenten gerne benutzen möchten. Ja.
Eine Sache noch, weil jemand die Lightning Talks angesprochen hat, was sehr gut ist. Also es gab schon einige, die sich im Forum einen Lightning Talk vorgeschlagen haben. Super. Und es gab schon andere, die darauf reagiert haben. Das ist klasse. Ich denke, Robert und ich, also bis jetzt gab es irgendwie noch nichts, glaube ich, wo wir gesagt hätten, nee, das geht gar nicht. Von daher, wir werden das noch irgendwie planen, wann das vielleicht am besten Sinn macht, die dann zu halten. Aber das ist natürlich schon mal super, dass sich Leute gemeldet haben.
Ja, das finde ich auch sehr gut. Ja? Also ich würde das genauso machen wie im letzten Wintersemester. Diejenigen, die einen Lightning Talk halten wollen, sagen mir Bescheid, sobald sie bereit sind. Und dann kriegt ihr einfach 5 Minuten Zeit in der nächsten Vorlesung. Und dann könnt ihr den halten. Und ihr sagt mir dann nur noch am Ende, ob ihr das auch veröffentlicht wollen oder nicht. Wenn nicht, dann schneiden wir es raus. Und das war's. Und wenn ihr zum Beispiel wissen wollt, ob es wirklich etwas ist, was auch viele Leute interessiert, ihr wollt ja vielleicht auch ehrliches Feedback bekommen, vielleicht könnt ihr auch sowas machen wie, ihr schlagt 2 Themenvorschläge vor und fragt, welches findet ihr interessanter. Oder ihr könnt auch vielleicht fragen, hey, will nicht jemand einen Lightning Talk zu Thema XY mal machen? Da habe ich zum Beispiel überlegt, ob ich nicht mal ins Forum reinschreibe, mich würde zum Beispiel ein Lightning Talk zum Thema Serverless Functions interessieren. Das könnt ihr ja auch machen. Das wäre ja vielleicht auch was. Ihr könnt ja andere darum bitten, einen Lightning Talk dazu zu machen. Es geht ja darum, dass ihr was lernt.
Dann würde ich langsam in die Pause übergehen. In einer Viertelstunde geht es dann weiter mit den Übungen. Also denkt daran, ihr habt an sich, gibt es jetzt 2 Gruppen. Ne? Es gibt jetzt die A-Gruppe, die zuerst dran ist und die B-Gruppe, die als zweites dran ist. Wir verstehen, dass ihr keinen Bock habt, jetzt alle irgendwie 1,5 Stunden zu warten. Das hat natürlich den Nachteil, dass wir sehr lange brauchen, um durch alle Räume durchzugehen. Wir haben aber auch keine Lust nachzusehen, wer jetzt Gruppe A und B ist und dann die rauszuschmeißen oder so. Das macht ja auch keinen Sinn. Also wenn euch das nervt, dass es eben ein bisschen dauern kann, dann würde ich sagen, der Klügere rückt nach und geht dann einfach in die zweite Gruppe. Da sind in der Regel weniger Leute da. Genau. Ansonsten sehen wir uns in einer Viertelstunde.
Ja, denkt einfach mit an eure Kursteilnehmerinnen und Kursteilnehmer, an eure Kommilitonen. Habt einfach Rücksicht und ich denke, das kriegt ihr schon hin. Ja. Es gibt ja auch sicherlich einige, für die es unproblematisch ist. Ich gehe mal davon aus, die meisten wollen in den ersten Block, aber vielleicht gibt es auch einige, die wirklich gerne in den zweiten Block nehmen. Wer weiß. Hauptsache ist, ihr versteht das doch, dass es einigermaßen ausgeglichen ist. Ich denke, das kriegt ihr aber hin.
Gut.
Noch Fragen? Seid ihr denn zufrieden mit dieser Art und Weise? Also, oder gibt es vielleicht auch Anmerkungen oder vielleicht Verbesserungsvorschläge, was das angeht? So ich sehe jetzt keine weiteren. Auf einmal schreiben 2 Leute in den Chat. Finde ich top. Was sagen die anderen? Vielleicht gibt es ja auch Leute, die es nicht so top finden. Plus. Okay, ja, wunderbar. 3 Leute finden es okay. Gut, dann würde ich sagen, machen wir mal eine Pause und dann sehen wir uns gleich.
Robert, die Aufnahmen dann beenden?